That's good for him, but if I don't want to die at 80, or I don't want my father to die at 80, it's none of his damn business.
What if you don't want to die at 19, but you don't have access to insulin? Medicare for All is one of the most important issues surrounding this upcoming election cycle. We have candidates like Warren and Sanders who are ardently advocating for the removal of private health insurance and the implementation of a single-payer healthcare system. Biden and the rest wanting to extend upon the current public options while still leaving private health insurance operating. As someone that does not reside within the United States, I have to say that it's kind of sad and unfortunate that you don't have a system like this already taking place. Most, if not all, other comparable Western countries provide healthcare to their citizens. It's not even a thing that people have to worry about. People just get sick, they go to the doctors, pay some small amount for the medicine they need, and not have to worry about it further. Every single person, whether they are extremely rich or unemployed and homeless, it doesn't matter. Everyone has access to healthcare. And this is like a bipartisan point of agreement. There aren't people that are advocating for the abolition of Medicare because it has pretty much overwhelming support across the political spectrum. To give you some perspective, quote, opinion polls for more than a decade have shown Medicare has high levels of support among both coalition and Labour voters. An essential poll asked voters in 2011 what they thought about 8 of the biggest federal policy decisions of the modern era. Medicare received overwhelming support. Almost 8 out of 10 said Medicare was either good or very good. Just 1 in 17 thought it was either bad or very bad. Australians' intuitive support for Medicare is backed up by international comparisons. We spend less on healthcare as a proportion of GDP than the OECD average and much less than the United States. But our health outcomes are good by world standards. Only 3 nations have a longer life expectancy at birth. Oftentimes, the claim levied upon someone like Bernie or Warren when advocating for Medicare for All is that they are radical socialists. To me, it just seems absurd. If you tell people in countries like Australia or Britain or Sweden or Norway that in the United States there is no robust public healthcare system and people have to fork out of their own pocket exorbitant amounts of money per year to have access to private health insurance and then on top of that still don't get the coverage for all the things they need, their honest reaction is one of shock. Like it's not even something that they could conceive to be possible in this day and age. The reason they don't have to think about it is because the socialized healthcare systems that we have just work. There aren't millions of people that don't have access to healthcare. There isn't national opioid epidemics that get people hooked on these painkillers because there's a profit incentive to sell pharmaceuticals. There aren't hundreds of thousands of people that have to sell all of their assets to pay overpriced medical bills, otherwise they go bankrupt. Like, it doesn't happen. Even to me, the one thing that I found perplexing is that in the US there are pharmaceutical ads on television. When I first was exposed to one of those ads, I was so fascinated. It was foreign to me. The thought that there is an economic incentive to overprescribe drugs is crazy to people in other parts of the world. The prevailing sentiment for other comparable countries is the opposite. They only give you access to the drugs you require to fix whatever your issue is. No more, no less. The mindset tends to fall on the side of being conservative with prescriptions because you don't want people to get hooked on these drugs, as it tends to lead to worse outcomes for society. These are some issues within capital markets surrounding healthcare that obviously aren't going to get fixed, especially on the current trajectory you are trending on. Extreme profit incentives in some industries just don't seem to work. Healthcare is one of those industries. Just let this fact sink in for a moment. 80% of the opiate painkillers on Earth are consumed by Americans. 80% of the total global supply. That is an issue so pervasive that it's even difficult to fathom. The reason that I'm doing this, for one, is that I truly want people to have access to healthcare. It's just such a basic thing that in the times we live in, the information era, the technology, the expansive economies we have, it's actually possible to achieve. But 2 is because, believe it or not, American politics impacts a lot of us in other countries. It's unfortunate what's happened with the advent of this new Trump right-wing movement, because that sent ripples all across the globe. You had the Brexit vote, which left the United Kingdom leaving the biggest collective trade partnership on the planet, Le Pen in France, the birth of these radical nationalist movements in Europe, the right-wing party of Australia winning the election. This stuff matters, and I feel America plays a big part in molding global political behaviors. Anyways, I just wanted to go over some common arguments that people on the right would often use in their arsenal to impede on Medicare for All from coming to fruition, and to hopefully bolster some effective counter-arguments for people that do want a universal healthcare system to take place within the United States. There is hope. It's not so far out of the ordinary for you to pragmatically acquire a public system. A lot of countries have this already. Not all of them have a 100% single-payer funded system, but at a minimum, it's some form of a public system that everyone has access to for minimal cost to the individual. In order for this to actually start happening and for America to be on the pathway to achieving universal healthcare, you have to convince the people, win over the war of ideas. From what I can tell, a lot of people are scared. They think that you are taking away their private health insurance and they won't have the same access or quality they have already. But no, that's not what is actually the case. This doesn't happen. When I watch the mainstream right defend the current system you have now, I find it so incredibly disingenuous and manipulative. Their arguments actually have no basis in empirical reality, and they are entirely predicated on subverting the facts. Even someone as propped up as Ben Shapiro, who is regarded as like this purveyor of intelligence and logic, has arguments that are just so profoundly misguided that it's honestly a joke. Even when implying slight empirical scrutiny or philosophical rigor, the premises he espouses just evaporate. They have no grounds. So today I will be going over some mainstream arguments and talking points, particularly ones used by Ben Shapiro, since he is a major political figure that a lot of people succumb to. To do this, I will use a video of when Ben Shapiro debated against universal healthcare at Politicon, because it is one in which Ben contextually lays out his thoughts on the matter at length. Let's begin.
The truth about healthcare is this. There are three qualities of healthcare that you can have. You can have affordability, you can have universality, or you can have quality. And you can have two of those three things, but not all three. Right? You can have universality, affordability, or quality. Two of those three things you can have.
So, straight off the bat, Ben instantly sets up a false dichotomy to frame his argument. You can simultaneously have all three of these things at once. They aren't mutually exclusive to each other. There isn't like some material natural law in the universe that precludes that a healthcare system be only two of those things. You can have all three concurrently. Not only is this true conceptually, but it is pragmatically true. We have countries in the world right this very instant that have all three of those concurrently occurring traits. Take Australia's healthcare system, for example. Let's start with universality. Universality is defined by how much accessibility the system has. Now, the Medicare system in Australia is virtually maxed out on universality. Every single citizen has access to free Medicare. There are no other requirements other than being a citizen. If you are a multimillionaire, if you are homeless, it does not matter. Every single person in the country gets healthcare via Medicare for free. So next, we can move on to affordability. Now, the way that we measure how affordable healthcare is simply by the per capita cost. Now, if we look at the per capita cost of healthcare in Australia, according to the official report by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, when adjusted to US dollars, it is just below $5,000 per person. Comparatively put, the per capita cost of healthcare in the United States, which of last year came out to be over $9,900 US dollars per person. So it is substantially more affordable, almost half the per capita cost. Not only is it comparably affordable when put against the United States, it is only just slightly above the OECD average per capita healthcare cost, when the United States are over double the average. Now, according to Ben, the other variable that we have left, quality, is impossible to have in the Australian Medicare system. Now, the way we can ascertain the quality of a healthcare system is by looking at the healthcare outcomes produced from that system. According to almost all of the OECD reports, JAMA, the Harvard findings, the United States underperforms most of these comparable countries in almost all metrics. To quote the 2018 Journal of American Medical Association report, it states, in 2016, the United States spent nearly twice as much as 10 high-income countries on medical care and performed less well on many population health outcomes. Contrary to some explanations for high spending, social spending, and healthcare utilization in the United States did not differ substantially from other high-income nations. Prices of labor and goods, including pharmaceuticals and devices, and also administrative costs, appear to be the main drivers of the differences in spending. Also, the United States spent approximately twice as much as other high-income countries on medical care, yet utilization rates in the United States were largely similar to those in other nations. Prices of labor and goods, including pharmaceuticals and administrative costs, appeared to be the major drivers of the difference in overall cost between the United States and other high-income countries. As patients, physicians, policymakers, and legislators actively debate the future of the US healthcare system, data such as this are needed to inform policy decisions. This is just one report. All of the other reports pretty much espouse the exact same thing, that the US spends nearly twice as much and performs either marginally or if not substantially worse than other comparable countries. Imagine unironically advocating for a system that costs double and performs worse. It is truly not logical. This is his first statement, by the way. Let's move on.
And the Republican Party seems to be falling into the trap of basically just copying what the Democrats do, except being worse at it. What they actually need to do is relieve the regulatory burden that is driving up the cost of healthcare.
Okay, so once again, this is not even remotely accurate. This is like the typical right-wing go-to answer when a product or service cannot be adequately priced for within a market. The regulation, it's the regulation, let the free market drive competition. Now, while this may be true in some economic markets, it is ubiquitously understood that people can't effectively shop for healthcare. It doesn't happen in the US, and it doesn't happen in any other country on the planet. This is the case for a variety of reasons. The esoteric nature of healthcare coverage and its equivocal and purposefully omitting language when advertising its services. The cost-benefit trade-off, for example, even when people get an explanation of benefits from insurers, pricing can still be pretty blurry. The average person just doesn't spend the time educating themselves on the complexities of their provider, and they shouldn't be expected to. No other comparable country places this unnecessary burden onto their citizens. They actually try to formulate the opposite. It is rather purposefully designed to be as easy intuitive, and as streamlined as it possibly can be, especially when something as final as death is a variable that is hinged upon its ease of use. Furthermore, what's driving up the cost of healthcare has little to do with regulations. The main driving factors for the obscene price peaks of the US healthcare system is things such as pricing of goods and services and utilization. Another big factor that is massively adding to the cost is the extreme administrative costs, which account for 1/4 of all healthcare spending, which would effectively be alleviated with a socialized system. You wouldn't need the sheer number of insurance liaisons, billing specialists, and clerks that it currently has. It would be subsidized and a single cost would be mandated, effectively cutting this issue almost completely out of the picture. If you go and compare the administrative cost to other comparable Western countries, you will see the steep discrepancy the US faces. Another factor that makes the cost of American healthcare system so absolutely ridiculous is the fact that there's no negotiation for drug prices. To someone that is outside of the US, this just seems insane. Why would the government not set price controls so as to counter the pharmaceutical companies with their long-term patents not to be able to monopolize and price gouge the fuck out of the system? I'm literally perplexed. This just seems like such a basic regulation that so obviously must be introduced. There is no logical reason not to do that unless you're accepting campaign contributions. It doesn't make sense. It's like, of course pharmaceutical companies are going to try and maximize their profits. They don't give a fuck about you or me. Profit reigns supreme. Even the current Medicare system at the moment in the US can't even negotiate for drug prices because it's been lobbied that way to not be able to. And there's too much jobs and money hinged on it for most politicians to speak up against. If there are externalities in markets, which in this case would be the well-being and lives of people that aren't getting addressed, the 101 answer is to set a regulation or an incentive. In economics, for example, there is a term called monopsony, for which is when there is only a single buyer in a market, which effectively means they have increased bargaining power for those products and services. Other countries already do this and it works well. Within the Australian Medicare system, for example, they have formulated the public benefit scheme, which is how they set prices for medicines back to the system and to the individual. You can search any single drug that is subsidized and see the pricing. From the outside looking in, the current US healthcare system seems incredibly antiquated and ineffectual. Anyway, let's move on.
And they need to stop acting as though insurance companies' jobs is actually just to reimburse people for their bad health. If you join up with an insurance company and your health sucks to begin with, you're going to pay more because it's an insurance company, not a charity.
I'm going to say something very radical right now. The goal isn't to punish people for their bad health. The goal is to try and prevent people from getting sick. Maybe there is a bit more compassion or clarity in the goals of societies outside of America. I don't know.
I would hope that the social fabric would help fill that in. This is why I'm a big believer in charity and churches and synagogues filling that gap.
I'm not even sure how to respond to that. If he seriously thinks that this will even remotely facilitate in covering any substantial costs, then I think there's some delusional dreaming going on there.
But what we can't do is suggest, as the Bernie Sanders left does, that healthcare is an inalienable right, and therefore you can put a gun to my wife's head, she's a doctor, and you can force her to provide care at any cost you want to pay.
First of all, no one is holding your wife at gunpoint. She still has the option not to work there and or work somewhere else if she chooses to. Within the private health insurance markets, you are also constricted in the prices you can charge. You can only charge what the market is going to pay. And if other companies are lowering their prices and your prices remain high, no one is going to use your service. Secondly, within a socialized healthcare system, there can simultaneously be private health insurance running alongside Medicare for people that have the wealth to use it. So there would be nothing stopping her from still quasi-setting her own prices if the US implemented something similar. Thirdly, what's the alternative? People that don't have the money or access to healthcare just die? Human life comes before profit and buying your wife's boyfriend a new Benz. Okay, Ben?
So this is Bernie Sanders shtick, obviously. The problem with Medicare for All is that when people say that it's affordable, this isn't affordable to the person who has the Medicare. It is not affordable to the country.
Again, this is incorrect. According to the OECD reports, the United States, even as a percentage of the GDP, pays significantly higher than other comparable countries with socialized healthcare systems. For example, the US is currently paying 17% as a percentage of the GDP, while Sweden is paying 10%, Canada is paying 10%, the United Kingdom is paying 9%, Australia is paying 9%, Norway is paying 10%. So again, Ben's argument here is baseless. His premises are falsifically predicated.
Just declaring things rights does not make them appear. What makes more things appear is a market-based system that creates more doctors, that creates more medical care, that creates more incentive for people to join up.
Not only does the data not support this, it actually indicates the antithesis of this. monopsony, and for other reasons I have touched on, drive the price down, not a market system in healthcare. If it did, we would be able to see with the healthcare system already in the States. But wait, it's actually performing horrendously in comparison.
The idea that you're going to have the government come in and then dictate the sort of care that you should provide to each particular patient, and then dictate how much you should be paid for that care, is going to lead to a decrease in the number of people who are going into the medical industry, which decreases the level of care overall.
So, first of all, the government already steps in and sets price controls in my country, for example, and there's not this massive staffing desert in healthcare. It seems to be working fine, not only here, but in all other industrialized Western countries. Secondly, the care decreasing from the number of people within a system is just a non sequitur. The empirical data from the OECD, JAMA, and many other organizations show that the US underperforms in nearly all quantifiable healthcare outcome metrics. So how is Ben's claim possible? How can he claim they underperform in care when all the reports on healthcare outcomes indicate the opposite? What metric is he using to substantiate his claims? It just doesn't make sense.
That it is better to treat things as goods than as rights, because declaring something a right just means that you have the right to steal it from me. But declaring something a good means that you get a market process that leads to lower prices and better care over time.
This is just like a vacuous quip that holds no basis in reality. By the way, just curious, how many people have to go without healthcare for this magical low price, innovative healthcare in the US to kick in? Like, it hasn't happened yet, and the situation is pretty dire at the moment, so I mean...
If you had an actual individual-based health insurance market, you bought it just like you bought your car insurance, you would see more and better health care for everyone.
This is just not true. We have been over the data. Empirically, this is just inaccurate. And I truly haven't even got a dog in the fight. I have access to a socialized healthcare system. My only bias is to truly do my part in facilitating other people have access to healthcare. If Ben's market-based system worked, and it actually led to more people having access to better healthcare, then guess what? I would be advocating for it. You know what's funny? The same as how that he would levy the claim that, oh, well, look at socialist countries, none of them have worked. Look at Venezuela, look at Cuba. Socialism has never worked, etc. I could levy the exact same claim against him here. Look at all the countries that have market-based healthcare systems that have worked. Oh wait, there's none. In fact, you're ranked 37 in healthcare performance. Let's look at some of Ben's arguments on how would this healthcare system get paid for.
One, what is your ideal tax rate? Because it's going to cost a lot of money for a lot of this stuff. And two, what is your ideal level of medical care? Because the fact is that we can spend millions of dollars on people at end-of-life care. We can spend millions of dollars on surgeries and preventative care. I mean, healthcare is an expensive business, even under a single-payer system, which is why generally you end up with rationing. So, what is your ideal level of healthcare that is provided to everyone, and what sort of tax rate are you proposing to subsidize that?
So this is actually a decent concern by Ben. You need to be able to figure out precisely where the funds will be coming for prior to enacting legislation and making it happen. Now, I'm certainly no expert in economics and where the most optimal tax base to take from to subsidize this program is, but it seems like there are a few obvious starting points. I think number one, you need to raise the capital gains tax. This is a no-brainer. You don't want to hurt people that are struggling or even middle class as much as people that have exorbitant amounts of income, especially when it's passive income from investing. Even a small VAT tax added may be required. A lot of countries already have a VAT tax and they seem to be fine. 2 to 5% is pretty reasonable. And despite that, the US per capita GDP is a lot more robust than these countries that have GSTs or equivalent VATs. Another thing to be considered may be a wealth tax. Once you hit a certain net income bracket, a flat fee isn't so out of the ordinary. But these are all minor forms of tax. The main tax you need to utilize to subsidize a program like this is raising the effective marginal tax rate from the top quintiles of wealth brackets and actually making them pay for it. The nominal tax rate is what the tax rate is in name. The effective tax rate is what they're actually paying after deductions, gearing, tax strategies. You need to legislate it so these companies can't have these quasi-headquarter companies overseas like an island, for example, and skip out on paying their fair share of taxes. It's kind of fucked how you have companies like Amazon dodging paying income tax. They utilize public infrastructure to run their businesses, roads, etc. They should be paying an effective fair tax rate, and you need to legislate it so they can't escape that. The next thing that I need to address in Ben's statement there is on the issue of rationing. I feel like this is a fear that is just so non-existent. It's not like the countries that have a socialized healthcare systems are like giving everyone access, but the quality is severely denigrated. If that were to be the case, then they wouldn't have better outcomes. Now, I'm not a fan of antidotes, but from my experience, you pretty much get covered for the most things you need, except for cosmetic stuff, of course. The notion of people going bankrupt and even paying massive healthcare bills is squarely a US problem. For example, the Australian Medicare system even has the luxury to cover people that are visiting the country from specific countries that we have made agreements with. I'm pretty sure if you are visiting from Belgium, Finland, the UK, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, and a few other countries, you can enroll into the Medicare system and be covered. So obviously the idea that rationing is a big concern is just not the case. If it were, then the Medicare system would be restricting its access and raising its rationing for the people currently within it, rather than right now extending the access. One last thing to add here. The fact that the cost is comprised under a single umbrella actually aligns the incentives in a good way. because it's part of a socialized system where people are paying into it via taxes, means they actually don't want to spend on things that aren't effective. So a lot more of the spending is centered around preventative care, because if we can spend $5,000 to prevent someone from costing a $50,000 surgery 5 years down the road, then that is infinitely better. The people are healthier and it costs less on the system.
We now have some of the highest corporate tax rates altogether in the industrialized world.
Nominally yes, but effectively no, especially with all the loopholes that don't get enforced. This is really a non-point. This is more of an appropriations issue. Here's an idea. Maybe if you didn't spend orders of magnitude more on the military budget than any other country, or even cutting down on some of the costs by ending the war on drugs, you could easily afford this. By the way, you might think that because you spend like an order of magnitude more on the military than any other country, that is somehow reflective on the strength or quality of your military. But this is simply not true. For example, you might spend like 10 times more, but you have a military that's only twice as good. This is due to all the inflated costs, so you really aren't getting a good deal there. Would you pay 10 times more for a car that's only twice as good? It's not really rational. When you have someone like Martin Shkreli that was charging $750 per pill back to the system, you bet that when that is extrapolated en masse and that is reflected on the cost of the premiums and everything else along the pricing chain of the healthcare system, the spend has to be proportionate to the benefit you receive, otherwise you are just throwing money down the drain and outpricing people, indirectly killing people for profit. Seems pretty illogical to me.
I'm not in favor of tax deductions. I'm in favor of a lower tax rate and get rid of a lot of the tax deductions, because I think that it's ridiculous that we have people gaming the system.
This is actually a really bad take from Ben. Tax deductions are actually a very good thing and they do a lot of benefit. The purpose of having tax deductions is so that you can specifically target demographics with taxes and alleviate specific groups of people from other taxes. So let's say you have a single mum with kids working 2 jobs. There are ways you can give people like this access to certain deductions that only people in similar situations can take advantage of. Or maybe you want a specific industry to flourish because you want to have a head start on the technology, or maybe because it's going to grant you some benefit in multilateral trade deals. You can give these industries and businesses certain deductions to incentivize growth by taking away some of the risk with newcomers into the industry. But let's say you have someone that is in an optimal tax base, someone buying their third Benz. You can maybe tax that person a little more than other groups by not giving them certain deductions, because they can afford to pay a little more than someone struggling. They are even good for countering externalities in markets. So let's say you have pollution that is an externality you want to try and mitigate. Maybe you can give green energy companies deductions so as to incentivize these companies to get into the market, become competitive, and then by having a little more advantage when competing against these established businesses so as you can lower pollution levels. So tax deductions are very good. They are profoundly effective in fixing certain problems. Now, I'm in accordance with Ben on restricting deductions on massive corporations that have accounting firms specifically trying to minimize the amount of taxes they pay in every way possible. These corporations can afford to pay a little more. So the whole idea that a socialized healthcare system can't be done is just not true. It's a matter of shifting their taxation base to the higher quintiles of wealth, selectively targeting certain businesses and actually enforcing them to pay it, not letting them get away with taxes because they donate $100,000 into your super PAC for your next election cycle.
The standard of care is the entire question when it comes to single-payer healthcare. That is the entire thing. If people felt like they were going to get the same access to care in a single-payer healthcare system as they did in a system where they can pay their own way, then we would have no controversy here.
We've been over the standard of care here. It's a non-point. But one thing I want to touch on here is that, yeah, people are probably scared that you're taking away their healthcare. One thing that when I saw that really made me frustrated was when I was watching the recent Democratic debates, the way the CNN framed the question when talking about healthcare.
Let's start the debate with the number one issue for Democratic voters, healthcare. And Senator Sanders, let's start with you. You support Medicare For All, which would eventually take private health insurance away from more than 150 million Americans in exchange for government-sponsored health care.
Like, come on, look at how prime that question is. I'm not sure if it was asked that way because they have pharmaceutical companies as sponsors, or maybe they don't want a public system, but that's horrible. They could have said something like, you support Medicare For All, which would be giving millions of people access to health and providing a better quality system for many more.
But the fact is that rationing is mandated as soon as you start having the government run the healthcare system and decide what level of care people get. So I don't want anyone deciding what level of care that I can get.
In a market-based system, there is already rationing anyway. You can only have access to what you can pay for versus what you have access to what the government allocates. The only difference is that in one system, people that have no money die, and in the other system, they don't. How can you complain about rationing when you have the worst healthcare outcomes? It doesn't make sense.
So I don't want anyone deciding what level of care that I can get. I don't want anyone else to. They don't care about me. They don't know my child's name. They don't know my name. All they know is how much I cost. I mean, Ezekiel Emanuel's at least honest about this. Ezekiel Emanuel comes out and says, listen, I want to die at 70, right? I want to die at 80. That's fine with me. I'd rather die at that. Well, that's good for him. But if I don't want to die at 80, or I don't want my father to die at 80, it's none of his damn business.
What if you don't want to die at 19, but you don't have access to insulin? This is just a total non sequitur here. This is just a total non-point here. What Ben is deliberately omitting is that with a socialized healthcare system, you can still upgrade the level of care you get if you have the money to do so. You can go to the best specialist, you can provide all the treatment you want for someone, there's no issue. You can do this simultaneously whilst having a system that just provides a base level of Medicare for everyone. These aren't mutually exclusive. I don't know Ben would dichotomize those. Just to put this into perspective, the patient cost for 10 milliliters of insulin in America is around $300. Under Medicare, which is Australia's socialized healthcare system, the patient cost for 10 milliliters of insulin is $27. Just let that sink in. Anyways, I just wanted to clear a few of those things up. Some misconceptions, some blatant attempts to mislead the realities of a socialized healthcare system. Keep fighting the good fight. It's not so far outside of the realm of possibilities that it can't happen for those of you who are seeing this from within the US. It's definitely possible. It's happening all over the world. It works. You have to win over the minds of the people. Some of these countries that have these systems and safety nets have had to fight for them. It's an uphill battle, but it can be done. You have extensive ideological international support. The world is watching. Shape the future.